This meeting is being recorded.
I am Aila'ntha. My family is Czech, and I've inherited the tendency to tell stories and sing songs and play music at the drop of a hat. The written version of this story can be found at this web address. There are a lot of notes, references, and links, including a short write-up of the reliability of the history referred to here. This story is told according to the conventions of Czech oral history, where certain phrases, a blessed memory, for instance, are repeated over and over. And the ending, for I know this is a true tale, is as common in Czech as once upon a time is in English. And this is a story, a legend. It's based on history, yes, but the eggs in the story may not be real, nor the other details. I've used a lot of Czech phrases in the story, translating so that they're understood. Charles IV, of blessed memory, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, looked out from Prague Castle, his beautiful home in the golden city of Prague above the Vltava, and watched the small boats and river rafts plying the water above the ruins of Judith Most, the Judith Bridge, which had been destroyed in a flood a decade earlier in 1342. Our blessed king had a desire to spend some money to make the lives of his people easier, and here was a good place to start. It was a struggle now to cross from Mala Strana, the lesser town, to the other side of the river, Staré Město, the old town where so many people lived. It was hard on the farmers bringing their produce to the markets because they had to hire boats to cross and sometimes couldn't make it to the far side at all. It was hard on the people who lived on the one side but worked on the other, hard for citizens to get to shops and markets that sold what they needed. Just the normal winter water levels made using boats very difficult, and accidents were common, and they really couldn't carry enough of what was necessary. And when there were floods, everything stopped. It was time to fix that. What was needed was a new bridge to let people and carts cross dry shod no matter what the weather. A magnificent bridge that would stand for centuries, protected by splitters that would stand upstream of the bridge pilings to fend off ice and debris that might damage them. No, that wasn't good enough. The bridge would have stone arches deeply set into the river bed to make it stronger, not pilings that would crumple when hit with floodwaters. Floods could not wash out stone. Kamienny most, it would be called, the stone bridge. It would be made of the finest materials, hard stone that wouldn't wear away, mortar of the best lime and sieved sand to make it regular, and eggs to make the mortar the strongest it could possibly be. That was going to take a lot of eggs. So plans were made. Astrologers were consulted. An architect was assigned. Charts of the materials that would be needed were drawn up. Wagons were gathered and more built for the transport of materials. Workmen's quarters were thrown up to house the hundreds of people that would work on the bridge, with stables to house the working animals. Orders went out from the king to the far corners of Bohemia, Morava, Silesko, the provinces of the Czech crown, and even farther for workers, stone, logs, limestone, coal, sand, eggs, fodder for the horses, food for the workers, and more and more and more. A beautiful founding stone was cut, and the roadways were cleared. And at 5:31 a.m. on the 9th of July, 1357, the first stone was laid by Charles IV himself. This specific time, a palindrome, 13579-731, was proper for the bridge and would give the bridge additional strength, since it would be echoed in the geometry of the arches that formed the base. Women were hired to staff the kitchens, making food for those who worked on the project, and to carry water and beer to the workers. They also did all the lighter tasks of counting stones, determining the quality of the materials, laundry, finding appropriate weights of loads so as not to overburden transport. Women did all the tasks that didn't take sheer muscle and often drove carts and wagons when the drivers were scarce. Lime kilns were built to burn the limestone into quicklime along the riverbank, downwind of the city, and in areas where breezes blew so no one would be blinded by the fumes. Coal and limestone began to pile up in the kilns to be layered in and cooked. Men were hired to rake the cooked rock into pools of river water to quickly cool. More men would then drag the cooled rock to a drying area and later a grinding shed where the stones were reduced to powder and shoveled into sacks. Wagons began rolling the slaked lime to the construction site as soon as the first batches were ready. Areas along the river with good sand were marked, and carts full began to head for the construction site. Trees were cut to make sheds to protect materials and for workspaces, and hay and straw for thatch to keep roadways from turning into muck pits, to make scaffolding, and the temporary cofferdams that made it possible to set the arches on bedrock below the river after sand and muck had been dug away. Huge settling ponds were constructed so that clean water would be available to make the best mortar, and there were sieves for sifting the sand. Finally, the eggs began to arrive in huge wagon loads, cushioned in sand and straw. Logs were piled up on Gampa Island on both sides of the Chertovka Channel, and even on the riverbank below the castle. Stones were cut and brought to flat areas on both sides of the river to be moved to the riverbank when there was space. And then the heavy construction work began. The cofferdams went in, and water was drained, and sand and muck were lifted bucket by bucket to be dumped into carts and taken to the Jewish quarter of Prague, the area now called Josefov, which kept flooding every year. First, an embankment, a levee, was built, and then the carts just dropped one load after another on the streets and around the homes. They lifted the area by as much as 12 feet. The area had been raised somewhat a few centuries before, but this would definitely help keep it drier than it had been, and it has worked all the way to the present day. Finally, stones were lowered into the cofferdammed and pumped areas, and mortar mixed. The slaked lime, sifted sand, clear water, and eggs went on to floors, as the sheds were called, where the mortar was mixed with large rakes back and forth, and set into buckets to be carted to where the stones were being laid and lowered bucket by bucket down to the level to begin the setting of the foundation of this marvelous bridge. The carts of leftover sand and straw went. Women were hired to sort the eggs from the sand and straw, and they would toss the eggs, shell and all, into the mix. The carts of leftover sand and straw went to the stables, and muck piles from the stables then went to the farm fields, and then they went for more eggs, around and around, over and over. Bit by bit, stone by stone, the foundation of the first arch went in. As quickly as it poked above the water level, the cofferdam was moved to the spot for the next foundation, the pump started up, the muck shoveled away, and on and on. 15 times to build the bases of the beautiful arches that hold even now. The splitters were built and the space between the arches filled in, and on and on. And more sand and more lime and more eggs arrived, and trees to make more shelters, and stone and workers to replace those who had gone home, and more carts of supplies and food. Whew. I'm getting tired just talking about it. Now, all those eggs came from farms from all over the country. A wagon would be sent to a village, and the number of eggs required would be announced. With much grumbling, but also gratitude that it was eggs and not money that was required, the wagon would be filled until the amount specified was reached, the time for the next load announced, and then the wagon would roll back to the golden city of Prague. There was one village where the inhabitants were really worried that eggs were breakable and perishable. Wasn't that going to be a problem? Well, the driver of the cart didn't know, so they did their best, and the required number of eggs rolled to the mortar mixing area. The first eggs of the load were tossed onto the mixing floor, smashed with the rakes, and everybody had to look twice. When they realized what they were seeing, a roar of laughter went up and repeated through the working area as people ran to tell others about the solution that this one village came up with. The eggs were hard boiled. So everyone ate well that evening, but the village never lived it down and is still called Aila'ntha Hrad, which means egg castle. When the bridge was finished after several years of hard work, it is said that Charles ceremonially ate a hard-boiled egg as part of the celebration. Leftover materials went to repair or strengthen structures along the river and for many other purposes. At least one of the lime kilns continued making its product that was still used in mortar, but also in public cemeteries to keep them sweet, sladka, rather than to be haunts of rats of disease. Charles IV went on to create the Hladovezet, which is called the Hunger Wall in English, during a time of great famine. He also created Hrad Karlstein, which is Karlstein Castle, for the protection of the Czech crown jewels. And he also began the work on Katedrala Svatý Vítuš, which is the Cathedral of St. Vitus, among many other public works. The bridge construction kept on going for most of another century to finish all the details, and it has needed repairs, balustrades, statues, lamps, and other details down through the centuries. But for most of 700 years, this bridge has stood, connecting the two sides of the city, thanks to hard work, lots of it, and eggs. An old Czech proverb is that an idea is easy until you start to build. And this definitely applies to the bridge. And so that you know, this is accurate as far as construction techniques, but the eggs are legendary. No one is certain how, why, or if they were actually used in mortar. Aila'ntha Hrad, the egg castle that I talked about there, and yes, the castle part is a sneer, doesn't appear on any map either, but everyone knows that it still exists, and everyone has a different idea of where. And I know this to be a true tale, for I ate at their table, drank at their feast, and danced at their wedding.